nature journal friends and enthusiasts. It has been a very long time since I made my last video that was art related, so I thought it was time. In the past few weeks, we have gone from very cold winter weather, like in the 30s, around freezing, all the way up to 80 degrees in the past several days. And because of that, we have had waves of migrating birds arrive all at once instead of spread out through the springtime. So I decided to take some time yesterday and I made a little sketch of some of our new arrivals, the ruby-crowned kinglets. To do this sketch, I pulled up an online reference. You can see my computer on the right-hand side of the video here. I have that reference up so I can continue using it while I paint. If you haven't used the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, I highly recommend it. They have fantastic images, they have fantastic audio, so that you can figure out what sorts of birds you are seeing in your neighborhood. All right, let's get painting. My palette is out. I'm starting to mix some of my initial washes to put down and get color going. I'm gonna cut over to where this sketch ended up in my sketchbook, and also my palette, which I will share a little bit more in depth later on in the video. It's kind of fun to see artist palettes, colors that they're using. That palette is something I carry with me outside for field sketching, and also I use it in the studio, and I don't make a lot of modifications to it. I don't use a ton of special colors. These initial washes that are going down, I'm trying to keep light so that I have some of the luminosity of the paper showing through. And in the practice of bird sketching, or really any animal or very specific subject, I have found it is important to stay within the lines. It just adds to the realism of my finished sketch. So I'm being kind of careful to stay within the lines and get some of these initial colors down. I like to work light to dark. It's a little bit different from how I work in oil, which is the opposite. I will go dark to light, the watercolor, because you're trying to keep that bright white from the paper as your lightest areas. And that's why I have to think a little bit differently than I do in oil painting. I am going to speed things up here a little bit so that we get to enjoy time painting on our own instead of just watching this video. So this is at 4 times normal speed. I have started mixing some darks and I'm mapping out those dark layers. Some areas I know are going to be very dark, so I go for pretty bold with that. It's taking me some time to adjust to how much watercolor will lighten during the drawing process, so keep that in mind as you're working with your colors. It's a bit of a struggle, but I also appreciate how delicate watercolor looks at the end of the process. Even when I've added a lot of layers, it still manages to look very fresh, and I enjoy the spontaneity of how the paper and the pigment and the water all interact together. So this painting is of a ruby-crowned kinglet. One of my favorite little spring migratory birds. Unfortunately, they do not stick around for super long, maybe a month. They're passing through as they go farther north looking for boreal forest for nesting areas. And that crown that you see is rarely visible. It's on the males during the breeding season. That crown will be displayed, but normally that's just a little kind of orange or ruby red streak that you see at the very top of the bird's head, so not always visible. The males are a little bit brighter yellow though, and I wanted to work that yellow in as my base layer here. They also have some distinct wing bars. They've got white wing bars, and then when the wings are folded up, they have all these interesting kind of dark stripes basically. As the primaries fold up or stack up on each other, it causes these interesting stripes to form with the bird's wings folded in. I'm switching to the background. I made sure that the detail areas in the tail and the foot, I had to let those dry because I don't want that to bleed out into the branch that I'm beginning to sketch in here. So after that's dried enough, just to the touch, I will start mapping in the branch, and I'm beginning to put down a clean water layer so that I can do a wet into wet background around this bird. I had to leave a little space between the edges of the kinglet and the background because in some spots I knew it just wasn't quite dry yet. Kinglets are camouflage masters. They are feeding in underbrush, and they like to have spots with lots of cover. Sometimes they'll feed on the ground. Often they like to be kind of in the low branches of shrubs. That shrub layer in the forest is where I hear them and where I look for them. Often it's the song that I will notice before I can see them, because they are 15% smaller than a black-capped chickadee, so they're teeny tiny little birds. One of their behaviors that makes them distinct is what I'm beginning to sketch in that lower drawing. I'm bringing pigment into that. They do an interesting wing flick, or they'll kind of hover or flutter their wings up at their sides. And I did a sketch of this behavior because it is definitely something that I look for behavior-wise to know this is a kinglet and not another type of warbler that I have spotted. The kinglet wing flutter looks very similar to baby birds when they're begging for food from their parents. However, in kinglets, the behavior, we see this in the adults. So it's not something that I've ever seen from a baby kinglet, although I don't think I've ever seen a baby kinglet. I can only imagine how teeny tiny that would be. As I go here, I'm going to add water to the paper. I'll map out the branch section for that lower sketch, and then I'll use clean water so that I can map out a background on that. And I'm going to be building up the layers because I want the kinglet to be a bright spot against a little bit darker background, a kind of darker blurry background, like if you were taking a photo into dense shrubs and you saw this. I want that bird to be kind of a focal point for each of these sketches. And I don't want to completely fill up the page. I do want some white space because I will add my notes back to this when I'm done with the painting process. So at this point, I think I'll switch over to some music so you can sit back and enjoy watching the painting process, and I will check back in at the end of the video. Here's my kit, cat not included. He decided it was a good time for a snooze. My palette is a split primary, and I have basically a warm and a cool of each of the primaries. I add a couple specialty colors that I use over and over and over, like yellow ochre. I have some extra blues for mixing sky versus water versus just creating darks. And I will swap out some additional greens as we go from winter into the summer season with more greens outside. My other thing that I really enjoy here is I have these Gray Matters travel brushes, the watercolor brushes, and I'm using mainly a size 8 and a size 4. These are great because they pop apart. Let me do this right here. And then this barrel fits over the bristles so you can pack it up and bring it back to your studio without risk of damaging your brushes. I find it super handy. These have lasted close to 2 years and I've enjoyed them quite a bit. They are a synthetic. And then underneath here is my sketchbook. I made this with a Coptic stitch, so I made the binding and I used a bunch of cold press watercolor paper that I had in my studio. So there you have it. I didn't forget the palette. I wanted to make sure that I shared that with you before the end of the video, in case you were curious. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed, please hit like and subscribe. I will be coming out with new videos like this in the future, so stay tuned and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.